The last piece of the puzzle of how to get a professional video quality is your capturing device, the camera. To get a professional looking video, you have to understand the camera and use it properly. No matter what you have expected, there is a lot of knowledge about the camera. The most basic operation of all is exposure. If you mess it up, your video will be a disaster that you can't even fix. Getting the proper exposure is the very first thing every time before you press that red button. There are lots of amateur videos that look so bad because they didn't expose right. But how to determine the right exposure, in fact, is pretty subjective. The general answer for the right exposure is you want your camera exposed meter points at the center or at least near the center. If it points to the right side, it means you're overexposed. Each increment is 1/3 of a stop. The left side means underexposed. If you have a subject, make sure to get your subject the right exposure first. The camera will evaluate the frame and tell you whether it's over or underexposed. It feels more like an AI power function, so it works most of the time, but if you shoot with a vast dark or bright background, like shooting in the night or in the snow, the metering may not work properly. In this case, you may have to over or underexpose your footage to get a satisfactory result. Of course, you can eyeball your monitor when adjusting, or you can use a more reliable tool in the camera, called Zebra. This black and white pattern usually tells you those areas are overexposed and have lost details, which means no matter how hard you have tried to recover in the post-production, you'll never get them back. So try your best to avoid the camera showing the zebra pattern. If you don't have a subject such as shooting landscape, the camera's exposure meter works better. Be aware not to overexpose the sky. You can use the zebra to find out. Another tool you can use to get the right exposure is the histogram. The histogram tells how the overall brightness is distributed across this frame. The scale from left to right indicates the brightness from shadow to highlights. The height of these waves indicates how many pixels in your frame are at this certain brightness. When you see the left side has more waves, that means many pixels in this frame are dark. Thus, it may be underexposed. If you see the right side has more waves, it means the frame is too bright, thus overexposed. The rule of thumb is to try your best to get most of the waves in the center, averagely distribute the rest across the histogram. If you are using video camera like camcorder or cinema camera, you may have a better tool to evaluate brightness, like Waveform. The Waveform is much intuitive than the histogram. The vertical scale represents the brightness, and the left to right scale is actually the video's content from the left to right. If you see my camera's monitor now, the middle area is higher than the left and right areas. The central area is actually representing me and my face brightness, which is now brighter than my background. If I pull a blackboard to block my face, you see the area indicating my face goes down, which means it becomes dark. You see, it's very easy to read. In this way, you can tell the brightness of the entire image and adjust exposure accordingly. Some video cameras don't have this function, but you can buy a monitor with Waveform instead. If you have the budget to buy it, make sure it also equips another helpful tool, the false color. This is even more intuitive than the Waveform. The false color simply renders your video with other different colors. Each color simply represents a particular brightness value, so you will easily find where it is too bright and where it is too dark. The false color works great on the human skin tone, so we can quickly determine if your subject is exposed correctly. Besides all this, you can also use a light meter, which is a classic method most cinematographers will use. But it's a bit expensive and requires you to understand the basic of cinematography. So it's your call. Now we have talked about finding the right exposure for your footage. The next, we're gonna talk about how to control the exposure. There are several parameters on the camera take charge of the exposure. The most basic two are aperture and shutter speed. If you are familiar with photography, you should know that you can easily control the exposure by changing these two parameters. While for video, they work quite differently. In fact, the aperture and the shutter speed are not ideal methods to control the exposure in shooting videos. If you change the parameters thoughtless just to get the proper exposure on your video, you may still end up getting an amateur-like video. It's actually a rookie mistake that many people are not aware of when they begin to learn video making. The aperture indeed controls the light. When you dial the aperture ring on the lens, you can control the light coming into the camera. The smaller number, the bigger aperture is, which means the more light will come through the lens, and the shallower the depth of field will be, and vice versa. Like I said in the previous video, if you want to have a blur background, you need to use a larger aperture. Because the aperture has such attributes, it becomes more like an aesthetic choice than a way to control the exposure. It makes the same sense in photography. Many portrait photographers like to use a larger aperture to shoot their models, and they can just change the shutter speed to control the exposure, no issue. But in video making, it's not like that. You see, there's frame rate in the video, which means it's already been exposed under a certain speed. You know a higher frame rate will result in a smoother video. So when the shutter speed kicks in, it affects the exposure and causes an effect called the motion blur. The cinema takes a lot of advantages from this effect. There is a so-called 180 rules in cinematography that defines the right shutter speed you should use to get the most cinematic image. The rule is simple to remember. You should double the number of your frame rate for the shutter speed. Say if you shoot 24 frames per second, you should set your shutter speed at 48, which means 1/48 for a second. If you shoot 60 frames per second, you set your shutter at 120, and so on. If you didn't see the number 180 in it, because it derives from the film camera, which has a disc-like shutter with 180-degree opening. Well, today, this rule tends to become a standard in the film industry. So that means if you shoot a video, you can change the shutter speed. It doesn't mean you can't use other shutter speed. You can use one shutter speed at a time. Higher shutter speed lessens the motion blur effect, making the video look like crispier. Hollywood loves to use high shutter speed to film action scenes, which makes the fight much vivid. As for the frame rate, the standard for video is 23.976 and 59.96. You may ask why not 24, since the film is presented in 24 frames per second. While yes, it's film standard, it still exists and is used in the cinema but not video. Nowadays, most of the videos watch on a small screen like TV, computers, phone, tablets, and based on the television standards. This odd frame rate number with decimal is because it relates to the old broadcasting technology. You may find there is another parameter that can control the exposure, which is called ISO. It was a number to identify a certain film stock's light sensitivity during the old times. In digital, it can boost the sensor to become more or less sensitive to the light. The truth is, you can use the ISO to get a proper exposure. However, it only has a limited range to choose from. Most of the camera offers an ISO range from 100 to 32,000, but rule of thumb, the safer zone is under ISO 3200. Once you go over, your footage will start having noises, making it look bad. But some brands have exceptional technologies that can allow you to use higher ISO to, 12,800 without noticeable noises. If you do a little research, you will find out. But professionals don't use ISO in this way. They'll set the ISO to the camera's native ISO and never change it. Because in the digital camera, the ISO is merely an in-camera amplification on the raw data. The native ISO has the least amplification on the original data, thus offering the least noise. The good news is, the modern cameras have a native ISO range, which means you can freely choose the range without worrying if it's native or not. Since you don't change the shutter speed and already set your aperture and ISO, the only way left is to control your exposure physically. This is also a professional way to expose your video. To control it physically, you either have to control the light source or have a managed environment. Both of them we have talked in my last videos. It's easy to control them indoors, but how about outdoors? Well, it just built indoors that looks like outdoors.
Wait, are you serious?
Yeah, Hollywood does that all the time.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah, I'm just kidding, okay? When I say managed environment means you find your shooting environment with exposure in mind. Like find an area with shade or partially open area. If it's not that case, you can find a specific time to shoot, like in golden hours. You can also use filters to decrease the light incoming into the lens. Neutral density filters, known as ND filters, are a popular method to control the light. It is designed to cut lights that come through the glass with multiple densities, labeled with stops or optical densities numbers, like ND1 or ND.3 means cutting down one stop light, and ND2 or ND.6 cuts two stops, and so on. Professionals use a 4x4 or 4x5.6 filters with a matte box, which also helps prevent lights from hitting the lens and causing the flares. You can also use screw-on filters if you don't have that much budget. If you're not really familiar with the calculating stops, one easy way is to use variable ND. You can just buy one filter instead of purchasing multiple filters with different densities. As you're screwing on your lens, you can simply rotate the filter to find the best exposure. Keep in mind, some high-end video camera has built-in NDs, so you don't have to use one if you shoot on those cameras. Whew. The exposure is definitely a big topic. Besides the exposure, there is some knowledge behind every camera technology. If you understand those technologies, you will always give your camera maximum performance. To achieve that, you need to make full use of camera's dynamic range. The dynamic range is the range from the darkest area to the brightest area that a camera can capture. Different cameras have different dynamic range, which means some cameras can see in the shadows while the others may not. The good news is, today's digital camera all have a pretty decent dynamic range, and there's not a huge difference between those cameras. You want to get the highest dynamic range for your video, so you will have the maximum details. In other words, you will have the best video quality. The easiest method to get a max dynamic range is to use the lock mode to shoot your video. The technology behind the lock mode is complicated. To put it simply, the lock mode is a specific mode that the camera will encode its original video data without any post adjustments, because those post adjustments are applied in the camera to get a picture to look normal on your monitor. In fact, they will decrease the dynamic range. Therefore, everything looks flat and washed out when you shoot in the lock mode because they are the unprocessed video with maximum details in those shadows and highlights. They look pretty unsatisfying. So if you want to get a good picture, you need to color correct them. This is the downside of using lock. It requires you to understand the color correction, while there is an easy way. Every camera with the lock mode usually has a LUT, L-U-T, known as Lookup Tables. It is a file that contains color information and is used to transform color input values to your desired output values. In this case, it can correct your video's colors. You need to load the file in your editing software and apply them to your footage. Sometimes you still have to tune the color and the contrast to get a better picture. But in this way, your footage has the maximum dynamic range. I will also make a video about the LUTs in the future and show you how to use them to simplify your color grading process. The lock mode is an important attribute of a camera, and it only exists on professional models. However, the market seems to expand its function to the consumer grade to have people take good advantage of their cameras. Sometimes you can see a camera is promoted to be able to shoot 10-bit 4:2 footage. That's another essential attribute of a camera. The 10-bit indicates the color depth. This means the camera can shoot more than 1 billion colors while common cameras shoot 8-bit, which is about 60 million colors. The 422 indicates the color sampling method that the camera uses to record. There are several of them. The most common ones are 422, 411, and 420. We are not talking about sampling technology. Well, just let you know that the 8-bit 240 is proven not sufficient because it's not working properly in the post. Like the lock mode, the 10-bit 244 can be found popular among those prosumer cameras, so shooting 10-bit footage with 244 will improve your footage quality. The last step is to choose the best encoding format. The most common one you can find in a camera is All-I and Long GOP. These two are compression algorithms of the recording media. I will always use the All-I because it offers better image quality over Long GOP. Some other video cameras can record ProRes, which provides superb video quality. Now with this knowledge in mind, you should be able to greatly enhance your video's quality. You see, I've already covered a lot, but most of them I just simply mentioned. To understand that, I will make more videos to explain them in details. So stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video.